Alright, so welcome to the first Cinema 4D scene for our Infectio project. And as you can see here, we have this skull and a ground plane, which is I've sculpted up to kind of meet the skull, make it look like it's settled inside it. They're multicolored at the moment, but they do actually have materials assigned, and we'll explore those later on when we get to the rendering stage. But what we want to think about right now is this is going to be our surface that we're going to infect with our Infectio modifier. And it's a bit of a complex surface at the moment, so it's going to require some preparation and some optimization to make it all work nice and smoothly. And we'll come back to that after we've kind of got the basics down on what Infectio is all about. So we can actually just hide this scene for now. It has a bunch of materials on it and things like that. We can talk about those later on and the lights and things like that. But for now, let's take a look at some of the basics of Infectio. To start things off, I'm actually going to emit onto a surface because I think that's probably the most common use case for this, but you don't actually have to have a surface for the Infectio modifier to work, and we'll demonstrate that a bit later as well. But let's just add a simple plane, and then we can add a material to this, and we're going to emit from that texture. So if I actually create a new material, and let's just give it some input in the color channel. So I'm going to use a noise, and if you've done any of the other training, this is quite a common workflow to emit from a texture. So if I just open that up, give that a bit more contrast, something like this. We'll tweak this like crazy in a second anyway, so you don't have to tweak it too much now. And let's apply that to our plane. You can drag it there, or you can drag it up onto there, of course. And there we go. Now, XP actually has a nice new thing, which is called Quick Tools, and we can actually emit from the texture. So if we bring up the commander, that's Shift C by default. And we can actually look at, not XP, emit from. So if we type the word emit from, we can actually see here, we get emit from object, emit from texture, emit from selection, and emit from vertex map. These are sort of convenience commands. And you could always even just dock these into your UI. I tend to do that. I've kept the UI clean for this one, so it's similar to everyone else's. But here you go, I can emit from texture. So I've got the object and the texture tag selected, emit from texture, and then the emitter's then set up to emit from the plane and utilize the texture mode. And there we go. So now if I press play, oh, those particles are very small. They're in dot mode. So I go to display, go to squares, press play. If you ever need to scale these particles up just in the viewport, you can go to display size factor. And you see you get these, the illusion, the squares actually when you scale them up have become circles, because when they're down this small, they actually only occupy sort of 4 pixels, so it appears like a square. It's a bit of a trick. It's an efficiency trick, but it gives the advantage that we can then scale it up and get that nice circle. For now, I'm just going to leave it at 100%. I just thought I'd mention that. And let's definitely increase the number of particles. So let's go to 10,000, and there we go. So we're emitting from the surface, and it's also taking the color from the surface. But that's not very obvious because we're moving the particles away. So if you want the particles to just be static at the beginning, we can just take the speed off. And if I hide our surface even, I held Shift and Alt at the same time there to do that quickly. And you can see it's emitting the particles only where there's a white value and none at the black value, but it's also setting the color. Now, this is an interesting trick. So if I change this to, let's change it to shot mode. And let's go to 100,000. It'll easily handle that. There we go. And you can see we still spin around, no problems. You can see that we've got this black and white color. If I go to the object tab, and you can see we've got emit channel, color channel, radius channel, speed, and scale. Just to demonstrate how this works, if I turn off the emit channel, so it's not referencing the textures channel at all, it'll just emit all over the surface in whatever default mode it was in before. So that's essentially like a polygon area mode. And then you can see the color is being taken from the texture, but not anything else. We could set the speed by the color channel as well. And you can probably guess what's going to happen. Essentially, well, first of all, we need some speed. If I press play now, they're all going to be moving off, but apart from the black ones, which are being multiplied. So you can imagine this. So the speed is being multiplied by the black and white values. And you can think of black and white as just 0 or 1s in this case. And they're just multiplying this 150. So pure white pixels will be going 150 units a second, and the black ones will be multiplied by 0, of course, and therefore 0, and then everything in between, the gradient in between. And that's cool, so you can get these nice interesting 3D structures. That's not what we're after here. We don't want the speed to be applied, so I'm just going to turn the speed to 0. I'm going to remove the speed channel so we're not applying any speed at all. And just demonstrate that we can actually utilize the same material and have different textures assigned to different channels. So we can have the color channel dictating the color. Let's change this to a much more... Well, let's change it to a different surface entirely. Let's go for tiles. The default colors aren't very nice. Maybe we do like a weave or waves. There we go. And let's just do some brighter colors. Some horrendous colors, I would suggest as well. But yeah, there we go. You can take the grout off it just so there's no blacks there. There we go. And then we could do in the luminance channel, we can then put our noise back in, or we could create whatever other thing. Now, it doesn't matter what this looks like. We could even turn all of these channels off. All XP is going to do, even if these are off, is just look for either the color here or the shader that's in here. So really, this is almost just utilizing the material as an emission source. Right, so, or a store, I should say, for the textures and things like that. So we've got our noise. Let's go back to our kind of slightly more contrasted. Let's change the seed a bit. And let's throw that onto... Oh, well, it's already on there, so that should just work. And if we just play that back now, we'll get just the color channel referenced. So if we go to the emit channel, set it to luminance, press play, and there we go. Our noise is now restricting where the particles are going to be emitting. We could just test one more out. Radius is quite an interesting one to do. If we actually turn luminance, the emit channel back off so it's an even distribution, we'll be able to see the radius a bit more. So if I change that to circles, and let's go into our object, and we change the radius channel to look at that luminance channel. We could store it in any of those other channels. Now, it doesn't appear to be very obviously working. Oh, in fact, that won't be working because we haven't given it a range of radius. So this one's a little bit different in the sense that we need to go to the emission tab, and here's the radius, and give it some variation, and it'll vary between those. There we go. So if I zoom in here, in fact, actually, let's grab the material, the noise. Let's give it a bit more contrast. Actually, no, not contrast. We want nice and soft. There we go, but we're going to eat away a bit more. Let's try a different noise. Let's try... And that's a bit aggressive. That's stupid. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Increase the radius. And there we go. We can get some really interesting looking effects. Now, we're not going to be worried too much about the radius here. We're going to be mostly interested in emitting on the first frame to set the scene for our Infectio modifier. So let's set this up to emit black and white particles. And I'll explain why in a second. So color channel. And it can just emit evenly over the whole surface for now. And, oh, let's use that noise. And let's set it back to like the default noise for now. So that's just standard noise. We could have it 200%. There we go. And if you want to see that previewed, you can see that. That's a preview of the UV noise. So, and that's important. So if I press play, you can see our particles are emitting, but they're taking the color from that noise. Let's jump to display, go back to squares. Check that, that's fine. I think it's going to need to be a bit more it's not pure white there, so let's just drag that in. I'll explain why in a second. And now let's add an Infectio modifier. So we can either find it here, so Shift-C brings up the commander, and we could go xpInfectio, or of course, it's always in the menus, or on a system object if we've got that. So this is a control modifier, so Infectio. And by default, nothing will happen. So if I press play, nothing happens because we need to tell the Infectio modifier where to infect from, where to start infecting from. And that's why we add a seed object. And if I press play now, you'll see straight away we get an interesting looking effect. And you can tell if I had the particles all the same color, that wouldn't be nearly as interesting. In fact, let's just show exactly what that looks like. Let's just put a flat white color in there, and it'll just move out circular. And what that's doing is the color, because if I go to the Infectio modifier, and it says incubation mode, and we can think of this as, you know, how a disease propagates or moves around, or a fungus or whatever it's going to be. In our case, definitely a fungus, slime mold, I think. What it's doing is it's looking for essentially food. The way I like to think of it is it's like food. Let's undo that noise change, actually. There we go. And if you think about it, these creatures or microorganisms, they're not moving per se. They're not actually physically moving. They're just consuming around them. So basically, they'll just consume and replicate and consume and replicate. So they need food to replicate, and therefore they'll spread. And so the way I think about this is that the white area here is the food, and the black area is no food, or maybe even something nasty that they don't like. And as you press play, you can see they propagate. So each particle is doing a radius search. It's looking around it, and that's actually what this blue area is. You can think of that as the search area of it looking for food. And if there's no food there, it replies to not create any new particles or create any new organisms, if you want to think of it like that. And away it goes. And I really love that, because straight away that's given us a very organic looking propagation. And of course the noise really dictates the look here. So let's say go to a Narky. This is one of my favorite noises, actually, because it's got some detail to it. There we go, press play. And you can see you get this organic propagation across the surface. And there's loads we can do with this. We could use a trail object to connect up these points. Let's just do that for fun. We're not going to actually use trails, I don't think, apart from in another part of this. So XP trail, and that adds. And we're going to change the mode from algorithm from no connections to Infectio. And that should work out which of these is the interior. So the red particles are the interior ones, and it's going to connect those up, but not the blue ones. And there you can see it's added those trails, connecting them all up. It looks really cool. Now that can be quite an intense. It took a few seconds there, so let's go back from the beginning. It's a bit lighter weight. And you can see it's propagating around, and obviously depending on the density of the particles, the trails are going to be quite interesting. What we can do is we can break them, so we can have them not quite as aggressively. There we go. So it doesn't propagate quite as far. But even just this, if we hide the emitter itself, this kind of network is kind of cool. That's looking a bit straw-like, kind of disconnected, so maybe I wouldn't break them quite as early. But yeah, that's the trail connections. That's the algorithm to look at Infectio. That's really cool. And if I delete that, we don't need that for now. Let's press play again, just see that's all working fine. Excellent. And like I said, the noise really does dictate things. What we can do as well is we could set the color. We don't have to set the color in the emitter itself. We can set it in a color modifier. So let's add a color modifier, XP color, and we can set it using a texture or a noise or whatever it's going to be. Let's actually test out one of these. So can you see that I've got these biohazard textures here, and I'll use this one with well, first of all, let's use the pure white one, because that'll just demonstrate a function. And I can just drop that on the plane. Let's go back to the beginning and let's show our plane. And you can see that's where it's assigned our seed object. Let's put that over here this time at the top. Actually, let's do it halfway down the side there. And what we're going to do is we're going to use, even though this emitter is going to emit, if I press play now, you can see everything goes white because the emitter emits its particles. Maybe it gives them color. It doesn't really matter, because as soon as they're emitted, they're taken over by this color modifier. And of course, we don't want it all to be white. We want it to be a texture. So color operation, use texture tag. And instead of the other one, let's use that one. Now if I press play, now you'll notice that looks weird. It's not, although it's kind of randomly colored the particles. If I hide the plane, you'll see it's just black and white. And that's because the particles don't actually know where this texture is relative to themselves. And so what we need to do is we need to tell the emitter to store the UV data of whatever it's emitting from. So what we do is we go to the extended data tab, UV emission data. Now when we press play, it knows where it should be. It knows where those particles are relative to the surface that it's being emitted from. And it gives them assigns them the color next to whichever part of the surface they're on. Okay, so our color modifier again. And remember I'm using the color channel in this one. And of course we could use multiple channels and that kind of thing. But you'll notice there's a problem. If you look at the propagation of this, it's sort of flickering and it's kind of going along, but as soon as it's infected, it goes white again and then it vanishes. And that's a bit of a weird thing. And the reason is that as soon as we are infecting the particles, they become red. And the incubating ones are the blue ones. That's the area it's looking for to turn them into an infected area. And the red ones obviously are the infected. And the color modifier is taking over that and it's just forcing it back to the white color or whatever the texture was that we've assigned in this color modifier. So what we need to do is we need to change this to change on birth only. And it does exactly as you'd think. It changes the color at the birth time only and then stops. And you can see that works perfectly to propagate around. And because this is solid white, it's happy to find food everywhere and it'll trace that shape. And this is going to come in handy later on where we're going to actually use this texture or a similar texture to create it to go across all our things. Now, I've let the timeline play there and you'll notice something happened to our infected particles. They've actually just died off. And if we go into our Infectio modifier, you'll see the infected particle lifespan is 300 at default. Now this is just a convenience thing. It basically allows them to die off separately without having to use groups and stuff like that. But we don't want to use this parameter, so we can actually send this to like a really high value. So whatever, as long as it's high and beyond your timeline, we never want the particles to die out and not be controlled by this. So that's fine. Now, if you'll notice, our seed object is only in contact with the outside area here. So if we want it to infect the interior area here, we're going to have to put some more seed objects. Or we could just make this one larger. So if I make it larger, there we go. You see, now if I nudge the frames instead of playing, I'm just going to press G. And you can see it infects that whole area there. But if I go on one frame more, that's when it starts to actually use the texture. So this is essentially a sort of override that forces the color of the particles to an infected state. And we could also use this thing called threshold. And the threshold is, you can think of it as a, not quite a probability, but it's cutting off the white colors of the, and it avoids infecting all the area. It'll just use the white colors. And so a little bit of a threshold helps. And you can see there, we're now infecting those. Now, also things to note, that hasn't managed to infect these particles in here. And when it gets to sort of thin areas like that, we need to think about what's going on. And let's actually look at what the Infectio modifier is doing exactly. So we've got these settings here. We've got search radius, max infected, and then lifespan we don't need to worry about. Now, the search radius is pretty self-explanatory. Around each particle, and if you look at this blue band here, this will actually probably be, well, the truth will be in the pudding here. Let's put a circle down and a radius of 10 I should do. There we go. Now, if you look at that, that matches up with our blue band. And what's going on is around each particle, so let's choose this one. So that particle there, let's scale them up in the display, go to the display tab. 300, there we go. And our circle, say it's around this particle here. It is sat here and it looks for neighbors. It's looking around itself and it's going to go, where's the nearest particle to me? Oh, it's this one. Is this food? Can it be infected? If it can be, change it to an infected particle. If it can't, just ignore it. Or just, leave it in its incubation state. So that is really, the simplest way to describe the Infectio modifier. It's just looking for neighbors that are edible. I'm going to say edible, but it's infectable particles. And the other ones, essentially, you can think of them as immune. So the black ones, which have no food, are immune to an infection because there is no food for the infection to spread. Okay, so let's zoom out. Let's put our particle scale back down again, a bit high. There we go. And so what's happening here is that we're not infecting enough particles for it to propagate. It's not finding enough food successfully. You know, even though they're next to each other, sometimes it needs like to find more than a certain number before it starts infecting. And we can tell it to infect more at one time. So each stage it can infect more. So currently it'll only ever infect, let's put it down to 1 and I'll show you. So if I put it to 1, basically it's only finding one particle, and that's not enough to propagate across. So it gets a certain direction, certain way, and then just stops. Let's zoom out a bit. And if I up it to 2, we'll start to see a few more particles being infected, and it gets way further. But even then, it's still missing out on some. It'll keep trying. It'll continually keep trying, and eventually, you know, you get more and more. But the default 3, that's probably the first time you see it properly move across the surface. Remember, it's not moving, it's actually just the particles changing state. So the particles are already there, they're just changing state. It's giving the illusion of motion. It's almost like a stop motion effect. So if I actually go to max infected 6, you'll see the propagation rate is much higher, and we get more particles infected, still not all of them. So we need to work out a way of doing that, and we can do something where there's certain things like search the nearest once will kind of make sure that the particle keeps searching for neighbors. Still not good enough. That's not the right one. Let's go to max infected 20. And you see straight away that's absorbed everything in its tracks. But that might not be convenient. You might not want to change the speed too much. So there are other options, which is the incubation multiplier. So that basically means these blue particles will get more of those, or it'll be more inclined to grab those things. And this, you can also think of this as a speed almost. So there we go, at which they get incubated. Keep increasing the numbers, and there we go. So combined with the incubation multiplier, which is multiplying the number of incubated particles, and the max infected, we kind of get a full coverage, or nearly full coverage. It's not quite there. Change it to 15 search radius. There we go. And those little last outliers there, you just have to play around until you eventually get them. So you can really think of, let's simplify this. We can really think of the max infected and the search radius as sort of speed parameters. If I drop the search radius down, but I have a reasonably high, let's say 6, it's slow, it's much, much slower, and it doesn't jump the gap. You can see it doesn't jump the gap anymore over to those other ones. So if we want everything to be absorbed, we need the search radius to be much higher so it can actually jump gaps. But it also makes it incredibly quick. All right. So obviously this is all one flat sort of material here. Or sorry, one flat color. If we look at the material, if I change this material to a one with grays and other things, this is actually going to really change the way that this propagates. And let's duplicate our seed object and always leave them as a child of the Infectio to make them work. And if I just, in fact, let's put one in each of these and we'll do an experiment. So I'm going to hold Control or Command if you're on Mac. I'm just going to move them over to here, over to here, over to here, and here. And then let's put one out here. And let's delete our original one. Now, you don't have to do anything else to those. They're already set up from earlier on. So we've got that radius. And if I press play, let's actually go back to our Infectio. Let's reset this all to default. Go down to here, reset to defaults. And you'll see at the default, oh, well, let's make sure the age, the infected lifespan is high. There we go. And you can see here, this is changing the way that the simulation moves. And up here, I mean, we're not getting any particles getting captured by this because the threshold is obviously too low on that color. Let's scale up the particles. 200, just visually, not. And there we go. You can see the white part gets infected quickest. Then as it grades up, they propagate depending on their color. Now this one's interesting up here. I'm not sure why that's not triggered up here. Let's go up here. Let's try dropping the threshold. Yeah, so if I drop the threshold, it catches it. And there we go. It kind of propagates, but it's slow and it's steppy. So that really does, it's important, the brightness values of the particles is what gives them their infectability or their incubative properties. It allows them to be infected. And that in turn affects the speed of how it moves across a surface. Okay, that's cool. Now, if you recall earlier, I mentioned that you can combine these channels and have them apply to different properties. So what we could do is or even simpler than that actually, let's create a shader that has 2 layers to it and also has a noise layer underneath it. So we can actually dictate the noise underneath. So let's use a fusion. So if I use a layer, now that's the more common way to layer up shaders in Cinema 4D's textures, or materials I should say, and you just stack them up and things like that. However, there's a limitation with the layer shader, and that's that it's single threaded, and XP won't be able to see this layer stack very well. So what we need to do is we need to leave this up here as just its bitmap, and we use something that works properly, and that's the fusion. And this is just like a 2-layer, not filter, undo. Fusion, there we go. And what this does is it's just like the layer shader, but it's single, it's 2 materials. You get a base one and a, if I jump into it, you'll see a blend channel and a base channel. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a noise. Let's leave it at default for now. And if I, let's say, multiply that over there, we get that texture there. And let's jump back out and drag that onto there. There we go. Now, if I press play, this noise is now involved as well. Now, it's not very clear because the noise is a bit too large scale. So say we do it like 30%, make it a bit more contrasted, like that. And now we can see we get this interesting movement across that surface. And another thing to consider is that because this is a radius search and a particle number search, the denser the particles, or the closer they are together, the more we're going to see the propagation settings will have an effect. So if I say, let's triple the shot count, and let's change the display to 100% because it's going to be quite dense, and press play. Now it slows the simulation down a bit, but it also slows down the propagation because, we've got, or it can speed it up, of course, but it depends. But you get much more detail. So you can see the noise is being represented much, much finer. And that's actually something along the lines of what we're going to apply to the skull. All right, so that's the basics of the Infectio modifier. Now there's a ton of other stuff that we can do with it. There are things like the search radius. We can actually vary that using some mapping. So obviously this is a set value of 10. You can see that's evenly spread across that surface. So it's a very even 10 units around each particle. Now we could map that with another noise or a shader or a texture or absolutely anything. So let's grab let's grab this noise actually. So let's go back here. Let's go back to the beginning. So we've got this noise here. It's a bit too aggressively. It's got the black there, which means that it's going to have some 0 radius, which we don't want too much of. Let's do that. And let's do sort of 50% scale. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this texture, and we can name these textures. If you go to the tag itself and you go to the basic tab, you can actually rename these. So we could call this one logo texture, and we could call this one noise texture, giving it underscores, so I better be consistent. There we go. And we jump into the Infectio modifier, jump to the mapping tab, add a map. And now this is a common workflow. If you've done any of the other projects, mapping is a really strong, really useful sort of feature of the X-Particles modifiers and dynamics modifiers. Now, here we've got the search radius we can drive. This is the parameter we're going to drive with the map. So search radius. And we could have it over age. That would just increase it over age. So if I press play, nothing's going to happen for a while. And then eventually the search radius will get high enough that it should start propagating. Although at the moment it looks like it might not even manage that. Yeah, so it doesn't even manage to increase to that point because it's multiplied by 0 at the start. If I flip that round, we should see... Yeah, so it does start propagating. But then that search radius should reduce over time, and eventually you'll actually get the particles probably stopping or getting close to stopping. There we go. So you can see past that 90 frame point, we're now multiplying the search radius by 0, so therefore no more particles are being included. And that can be useful, and we might use that later on. That's called foreshadowing. And I'm going to add a texture instead of the age. I'm going to drag this texture down to here, the noise texture tag. And the channel we're referencing is the color. Let's double check. Yes, it's definitely the color channel. There we go. Back to the Infectio mod. And currently it's set to unique random. If I press play now, let's hide this surface just so we can see everything clear. Now, that is working to an extent, but what it's doing, is that clear? Let me scale those particles up so it's really clear. So it's actually randomizing those particles, but it's not based on this noise at all. So if I just turn that off, you can see we should be seeing thick kind of areas here, and then it thins out and then it gets thicker, but much less frequent than that is occurring. And that's because what the Infectio, this sample position is just taking a random sample across the noise shader. So if that was a color, well, basically it's just looking at the random pixels and randomly assigning it to the particles. So that it's not utilizing the position or the UVs. So what we'll do is we'll set emission UVs, of course, press play, and now we're seeing a much more defined shape of the search radius. And if you notice, it's actually stalling pretty early on, but it then does change. It comes back again. And now if I hide the particles again, you can see here, this is probably the clearest area where it's going to happen. If I get a doodle paint out, and we just draw a line. Oh, actually, let's make it an obvious color. I use this pretty rarely, but it's kind of useful sometimes to just test stuff like this. So you can see here we've got these kind of areas where the search radius is increasing. And that should line up somewhat with the shader below. Famous last words. Let's turn that off. Yeah, so here we go. So this area here, the particles have a much higher radius. And then it goes to sort of 0 in the blacker area here. And that's worked quite nicely. So that's another way to kind of vary the rate and make it look a little bit more organic, or even not even organic. You might want to use sort of a grid texture, and it might actually have that look to it. So, in fact, if we just no, let's not do that now. I think we've demonstrated the way that works quite well, and otherwise we wouldn't have time to do everything else. So Infectio, let's go to the map. That's working nicely. Now it's a little bit. This is sort of bottoming out a bit too much there, so I'm going to change the noise and make it less contrasted. There we go. Now if I press play, that should keep its pace, but also, there we go. So that's really more about the search edge. And if I take our fusion, and if I just drop the multiplier down so that it's just the, oh no, other way around. Oh no, let's drag the noise into the luminance channel. There we go. And change the emitter to reference the luminance. Oh, that's still referencing that color channel for the color. Oh, of course, because it's in the emitter. There we go. So color, object. That should reference the luminance. There we go. And we can see here it's a little clearer on this, but the search radius is randomized, but also the shader, the immunity, if you think of it in the inverse, the food area is helping it propagate. All right, so I think that's covered the basics and the fundamentals of Infectio. We're going to use it a slightly different way. We have this, we have the incubation multiplier. We're going to play around with that a bit. There's the immunity level. Now, I should just mention that whilst we're here. Now, the immunity level, essentially, you can drive this using maps and things, but it's like another multiplier, but in reverse. It kills off the incubating particles, if you like, or creatures much quicker, so it can restrict the shape a bit more. And you see it's killing off the blue particles, and that's giving us a nice looking shape as well. So we can tweak all these settings depending on our use case, but that's the basics of the Infectio. Now these color modes here, we're going to use grade groups. So we want to be able to address the groups slightly differently and put them in an open VDB and have different radii for each of them. So we're going to set to use groups, and then we have these two options here, incubating group and infected group. And what we can do is we can just hit add group. Now I hold control or command down so that I stay selecting the modifier. If I let go of control and command and I hit add group, it's going to select the object you've just created. A little tip there. Let's go back to our nice logo. Color channel. There we go. Awesome. And that's still groups now, so it's still got the blue and red colors, and that's kind of useful for diagnosing things, but we can change that if we like. So that's now going to respect the group color. It's also going to respect the group's radius. So if I change the display mode to circles on this, oh, they're very large. So let's put them down to, say, 1 unit. There we go. And that can be our leading edge. So you don't have to render these. You could actually have these hidden. So I could change this display mode to none. Press play. And there we go. We've got that propagating, and you can't see that leading edge anymore. The incubating particles aren't displaying. And that might suit certain scenarios. I think we'll probably use our incubating particles. I quite like the look of those. But yeah, depending on what you want to do. So let's undo a few steps. And let's jump into the, let's go back to the beginning here and press play. It's working nicely. So one other thing is you'll notice that we're emitting particles over the whole surface. So the whole surface of this plane is being utilized for particles. And that's not very efficient. So if I hide this here, now we could hide our original particles by going into the display tab of the emitter. And if you've ever wondered why the none parameter is in the edit, or the none mode is in the display options, this is why. So if I turn the plane back on, make sure the emitter is in none mode, and we now no longer see those particles that are there, but they are there and they are being processed. And that can be inefficient. So, you know, our particles are comparing to everything. It's having the color applied to them, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of inefficient. We want it to just emit in the area that we want to cover. So we could either create a custom mask, or we could just utilize what we already have. So if I jump into our biohazard material, and I'm just going to reset it back so that the color is the only one we've got here. And then the luminance I'm just going to leave as a noise. Now this one here is going to be where we're going to emit. So let's go back to the emitter, object tab, and it's currently set to the noise texture. I want to add the logo texture instead. And that's only going to emit, I only want it to emit on that surface. So what I need to do is I need to turn off the color channel. Well, actually, I can leave the color channel on, I can just have it reference the noise, but it's irrelevant because the XP color modifier just comes in and takes over anyway. So what I could do is just turn off the color channel completely, and then make sure that I'm referencing the color channel for the emit channel, which has our biohazard shader in it. If I press play now, you see it becomes incredibly dense. Something's going on. So what's happened, if I go back to our emitter, hit display, and just do squares, go back, you'll notice that it's only emitting in the surface and sort of the area that we want it to. And then the operation, the Infectio operation, only occurs inside that. So let's just scale down this display factor. And we're still at like 300,000 particles. I could drop it to 100,000 now, probably even less. And you can see we get a really fine simulation, but it's much faster. So if I put it back up at that 300,000, the FPS that we're getting is, well, we're getting about 3 FPS. But if I decrease the amount, it's much, much faster, 30 FPS, 10 times faster. And there we go. Now, obviously, that texture is using the noise. Let's grab now we can just grab this noise texture here, and that's what's going to set our particle color. So that's this one here. So this is our noise texture. Probably should call that noise material, or actually just call it I like to name things referencing the object they're being referenced by. So that's driving our color noise there, and that's what we're going to do. So jump there, noise texture, it's referencing the color channel, correct. Press play. And you can see that's now applying our texture. And you can see our boundary is varying as well. So we get 2 stages of sort of organic searching. Because it's not very well contrasted, we're not getting any kind of missing areas, which I think we do want eventually. Maybe go for like something like this. There you go. So I've gone too far there because now it's completely stopping it. If I drop the scale down, remember the noise will be smaller, but the search radius can still hop over some areas if it's large enough. So we can see that propagating across nicely. It's a bit more of a smooth transition perhaps, but I quite like it when it's got these large sort of chunky areas of faster motion and then slower. But I don't want it to go to full stop. So let's do that. Slightly more contrasted. There we go. Something like that. And then you can see it finally makes it across, bouncing across, giving us a variable rate. Awesome. Okay, so there we go. That's the first scene. I've called that one the spread because that's exactly what it's doing. Now we need to apply this to our skull scene. So that's going to be the next video.